talk a little bit more about Buddha and what we can learn from the story of Buddha.
Hmm. Well, many things as usual. But let's start from the beginning. So his life story I'll summarize quickly and sort of combine it with his final sort of enlightenment and the essence of his teaching, right? So it's a pretty nice story. There's some mythology involved, right? We kind of have different versions of his life story, so it's a bit mythological. We don't know the exact facts of his life, but the general story goes something like this. He was basically like a kind of prince that lived in this sort of palace and community, which was very isolated, right, insulated from sort of the regular world, right, rich family. And part of the myth says that somebody actually predicted when he was born that he was going to be a great man, like either a great religious leader or a great political leader. He ended up being a great religious leader, right, a spiritual leader. And someone predicted that. But anyways, the story goes that he lives this normal life of a prince, very protected with everything he wanted, right? Food, shelter, and everything. And he actually got married, they say, and was married and had some kids. But then one day, this is where the story gets interesting, he leaves the palace and starts to see, he goes in a chariot or something, they say. He got his limo driver, to put it in modern context, like, hey, driver, take me outside, our palace and such, our community. I want to see the real world. And he goes out of the palace, his limo or chariot, whichever picture you prefer. And he starts to see the real world. And what he discovers, horrified. In a nutshell, he sees suffering. That humanity's actually always suffering, and they give some details in the story. Usually, he sees people down to there's death, and then there's disease, people getting sick, and people having bad luck or whatever, emotional issues, and all kinds of suffering. So he sees human beings are just in suffering. Right? And so then he's so disturbed by this, the story goes, and of course we don't really know too many of the details, but somehow, for whatever reason, apparently because of this experience, maybe because of the shock of being insulated and living such a protected life, it hit him hard. And so that put him in a state of suffering, I presume, to the point that he made it his life's goal to solve the problem of suffering. So he thinks, human beings are suffering, and he's so disturbed, and he's like, I have to solve this. And he leaves his whole life. He leaves the palace, he leaves his wife and kids, everything. He leaves everything behind. He's a pretty crazy guy. Or, you might say, determined or passionate to find this truth. And it's quite noble, right? Because he's actually thinking of humanity. He wants to solve the problem of suffering for all of us. And to our benefit, apparently, he did. Right? That's why he become so famous. The Buddha, which, by the way, means the enlightened one. Right? His original name was Siddhartha. And so once he got the answer to the problem of suffering, he becomes the enlightened one. Now, to fill in a little bit of the journey, once he goes out of the palace and he goes on the search, they say he was trying different things and going to different teachers and so forth. And in fact, he comes from India and he practiced under traditional Indian gurus and teachers and went to some ascetics, they say, ascetic forms of Hinduism, and he learned to meditate in traditional ways of Hinduism to transcend suffering and transcend the body. But the story goes that he tried all these traditional spiritual practices and he was not satisfied. And to be very specific, this might help understand Buddhism and why it's special or different than, let's say, Hinduism in some ways. And that's the story goes that he tried asceticism, like denying the body, and he was like surviving on like a grain of rice or something ridiculous like that a day, a minimum eating, to deny the body, which is the form of some Hindu traditions, because like the absolute truth is like beyond the physical, and that helps meditation. And the Bhagavad Gita, there's actually a line that says that if you abstain from eating, you can go deeper within to see the truth of the self, right? And the absolute truth, the path toward the Hindu enlightenment, so to speak, or at least some practices of Hinduism. So he was learning that, right? And so they learned to meditate and go within to find the true self, the Atman, or to know God, Brahman, the ultimate reality. And he tried that. And he said, I felt the infinite peace, the bliss that they describe Brahman as, right? The ultimate reality, which they call Brahman. They say it's pure being, pure bliss, pure consciousness, right? And that's the goal of the Hindu path, right? To achieve this kind of knowledge of the true self and of God. Wonderful. But he said, I achieved this state, but then when I wasn't meditating, I was back to suffering. So that was dissatisfaction for him. And he continues on his journey and leaves the monastery and leaves those monks, right? Leaves the ascetic life or that Hindu path, because it didn't give him ultimate fulfillment. In other words, it didn't solve the problem of suffering for good, right? He wanted a permanent solution, not just a temporary blissful moments while you're meditating. He's like, oh, what about when you're not meditating? That's what I'm worried about, because I still gotta live out here, right? So then what? So he continues on his journey, and like that. So he's sitting under the famous tree of enlightenment, where he achieves his enlightenment. And they say that he decided one day to sit there, and he said to himself, I'm not gonna get up from here until I figure this out. And he goes into meditating or reflection, whatever, and he's sitting there. He's like, I'm not moving until I'm enlightened, until I figure the problem of suffering out. And then he gets it. Wow. And what he discovers, he breaks down, eventually he teaches it. Once he is enlightened, and he's like, okay, I figured it out. And they say he got up and went to eat something. The opposite of the ascetics. He eventually, when he's enlightened, he doesn't practice the traditional Hindu way that he was familiar with, which is more ascetic, right? Self-denying, denying of the body. And he actually goes to eat. It's the first thing he does, they say, right? Here's what he realizes. He breaks it down into what we call the Four Noble Truths, right? So he has this realization. And the first noble truth is the first obvious thing, which is where the story started, that there is, so this is very common in like Alcoholics Anonymous. If you don't realize you have a problem, you can't solve it, right? You have to hit rock bottom and acknowledge it, right? So he says that's the first step. The first truth you need to realize. There is suffering. Be aware of it. Specifically, he defines it as dukkha, which translates as dissatisfaction, right? So it's not just physical pain. Just general suffering is a kind of suffering that's being dissatisfied with. So there's suffering, dukkha. The second noble truth is to realize the cause. So he realizes there's suffering, and then he realizes what the cause of it is, and he says the cause is craving and or attachment, right? So that's the second truth. So the third realization is that there is a solution to the cause of suffering, which some people call nirvana or enlightenment, right? So he realizes the second noble truth, that there is a root or a cause to the suffering, and that the third truth is that we can eliminate the suffering. And then the fourth is the path to eliminating suffering, right? How do we? So the last noble truth is basically what they call the eightfold path, which includes right livelihood, right thought, right perspective, and so forth. I'm not going to go into all the 8 ones, right? But it's basically learning to see reality in the right way, because the root of suffering that we said was craving has to do with a kind of ignorance, not knowing the nature of reality. In other words, the root of the suffering is that we don't know the true nature of reality, which the Buddha says is constant flux, constant change. And there's interconnectedness between all things, and everything is in constant motion and changing. So part of the reason that the root of suffering is this clinging is that what we're doing when we cling is that we're trying to hold on to something that's always changing. So we want something permanent out of something impermanent. That's contradiction, right? Logically and existentially, right? So that's his realization. He's saying, well, we're trying to cling to something that's always changing. And so if we do that, we're going to suffer, because it's kind of like we're expecting the wrong thing. So another way to put it is that, like, expectation is actually what's suffering. What's making you suffer. So if you expect something that's wrong, you're going to be disappointed. So he's saying you got to recognize what the nature of reality is and not expect the wrong things out of reality, and accept reality as it is. So if reality is in constant changing, you say, okay, reality is changing. Don't cling to it. You just let it go and let it be, right? So that means then that if you're able to not cling to things, you're enlightened, you're nirvana, and you'll have peace forever and ever and ever. Right? Now, most people can't do that, which is why you have monasteries and practices and meditation centers and long journey of spiritual practice, because it might take a while for you to actually detach from the world, or from the desire to cling to the world. Which, by the way, to be clear, he doesn't think that natural desires are bad, right? Like, it's okay to be hungry. Which, going back to the point I made earlier, the first thing he does when he gets enlightened is go eat, because you realize that eating is not the problem. It's the attaching to the food that you, in other words, if you're hungry, okay, your body needs food. You can eat and then forget about it and move on to something else, i.e. to something new, right? But if I eat something and I say, oh, this was the best food ever, I want it again, the same meal, this rice and beans and chicken or whatever, curry or or mangoes or whatever your favorite food is. Oh, I love mangoes, I need them, I need to have my mangoes every day. Now you're clinging to the mango. But if you just have that one mango and then you just let the next day be whatever it is and have whatever food is available, then you just eat whatever's there. And you accept the change that, oh, well, today we had mangoes, tomorrow we could have cherries, or tomorrow we can have rye. And you're okay with whatever life brings you, rather than just grabbing on to, oh, that's the thing, right, that I want. And if I don't have that, I'm dissatisfied, see? And that's dukkha. So it's not what happens in the physical world for the Buddha, it's how you react to it, or whether you cling to it or not, that's going to cause you the suffering. That's why I think in a previous conversation, I said that even pain, in a sense, in Buddha's sense, is not suffering, right? You can say, ow, you get hit. Okay, you had a momentary pain, but usually what we think as suffering is being upset about the fact that you had some pain. But if you don't judge the pain, then are you really suffering? Technically, in Buddha's sense, no, because he defines it, right, dukkha, as satisfaction, dissatisfaction. So you don't have to be dissatisfied by the fact that you have some even illness or disease or a little pain here and there. Who says that's bad? You. Your mind. Because you're attached to the idea, I shouldn't be feeling pain. this is horrible. Okay, who says that's horrible? You. Right? Do you have to say that? No. So that's an attachment, right? And that's why, he universalizes that and says, well, the goal is to remove suffering. So therefore, any thoughts that causes me suffering, just let it go. And that's why he's famous for denying the self, or talking about the idea of the self, which is kind of a Hindu concept, right? The real self, the Atman, and that was the goal in Hinduism, or knowing Brahman and God, or the gods, or whatever. There was a certain kind of knowledge that Hinduism was based on, right? That was the solution to our suffering, or to our enlightenment, and transcending the life and death, right? The cycle of rebirth. And so that's the goal in Hinduism. But he says these ideas can actually be part of the problem. Because then you're clinging to certain concepts of what the self is and who and what you are. And these ideas can cause you suffering. So why? A nice example that I like to give that can be relevant, I think, did you ask, how did you know the question?
How can we learn from the story of
What can we learn from the story of the Buddha? Yeah. So I think this is a valuable lesson that can transcend all religions, by the way. And this is why Buddhism has become so popular, actually, because whether you're religious or not, you can practice Buddhism, right? Because it's not a doctrine. It's not a list of beliefs per se. It's actually telling you, pay attention to reality and act accordingly if you don't want to suffer. I don't care what you believe, but look at how things are, and you tell me how you're going to get rid of your suffering. So the Buddha is giving you a practical way to respond to life in such a way that you don't suffer. So if that's what you want, Buddha has a solution, right, or a path. And so a nice example I like to give that is beyond Hinduism or even particularly Buddhism is this idea that our thoughts and our attachment to our thoughts and or ideologies can cause us suffering. So, for example, if you have a certain idea of God or what God is or who God is, that can cause you suffering. Suppose your idea of God is, God is loving and God loves humans and loves me and loves us. So therefore, if God loves me, if you also have the idea that love requires that they give you everything you want and take care of you, every single need and desire, then the moment you don't get something you want, you're suffering and you're mad at God. So not only are you mad that you didn't get the house you wanted, but now you're pissed off with God because you're like, hey God, you're supposed to take care of me. Why don't I have a house yet? Or why don't I have this yet? Why don't I have that yet? So now you suffer more, actually. You add to your suffering because you have a certain concept of God, which might be wrong. And for the Buddha, I think there is this general teaching where it's like, well, if it's causing you suffering, is that what God wants for you anyways? So maybe precisely, if you were talking to the Buddha, maybe he would say, yeah, maybe that's what God would want you to learn, actually, what I'm teaching you. Maybe God would teach us detachment as well. That's arguable. And just to end that side comment there, it could be the case that the Buddha is right? This imaginary thought that I just had of, well, if we were talking to the Buddha and we're talking in this religious context, well, what would he imagine that God would say to us? Like God's sort of wisdom teaching. Maybe God's wisdom teaching would be detaching, because if you look at other religions actually throughout the world, oftentimes the God relation requires self-sacrifice, i.e. unattachment, right? Not being attached to things, not being, greedy, hungry for the world, for worldly things. That's usually the spiritual path in almost any religion, right? Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity especially. Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow me. Your cross symbolizes like the suffering I went through, you also suffer. Like life is gonna be difficult, but accept it. Surrender. So the spiritual life might actually be, throughout all religions, learning to accept reality as it is. And then you're at peace. Last quote. St. Paul said, he talked about the peace that transcends all understanding. And he suffered a lot. He was put in prison and whooped, beat up and such. And I think he was killed. I forget how he died exactly, but persecuted, right? And he was at peace. How? Because he wasn't attaching to a certain idea of life and how life should be. See? So it's our expectations, to conclude. Our expectations are clinging for things to be a certain way that makes us suffering. But if you don't cling to life being a certain kind of way, you're at peace.